groups, very tough topic, mediation, rather a soft approach. So we are all wondering how this fits together, and we are absolutely thrilled to hear about your experience and what you want to share with us. So I hand over to you, Ben. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience.
Thanks so much, Andrea, and great to see everyone here and meet you all. So, yes, as Andrea says, I'm here to talk about the issue that I spend all my time working on now, really, which is I guess, the intersection of crime and conflict and what that means for mediators and negotiators. And I think you're absolutely right, Andrea. There's not many experts in this field. I mean, I'm a kind of self-declared expert, I guess. Or I don't know. I haven't got a qualification in this. I don't think you can get a university degree in this stuff. But it's a real gap in the sector, and that's really going to be a sort of part of the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. So really, yes, I mean, I thought the plan would be I would speak for maybe about 40 odd minutes and leave some time for questions, because I would hope there would be some questions. Definitely a lot of complexity, a lot of confusion, I think, around this issue. Open my presentation by briefly talking about my background, perhaps not to make it all about me, although I do enjoy doing that, but because I think it's actually important to sort of see I guess the journey of my career and how I ended up working in this space and on these issues. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I would say is probably the key feature of organized crime in the modern world, and that's how enmeshed it is with politics. And I would say this is the key feature for mediators and why it is an issue that mediators, and when I say mediators, I generally mean mediators working on armed conflict and negotiators working on armed conflict. I do think this is a key topic for them. And it's really a global issue, although I'm going to talk mostly about conflict zones and fragile states and how crime and politics intermesh in these spaces. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the implications then for mediators working on armed conflict, and sort of what the implications are for the conflicts themselves and what this means for the chances for peace and dealing with violence. In the Q&A, happy to receive any questions when the time comes, even if you want to ask me something else about mediation, for example, because I've worked in normal mediation for most of my career as well. My background, I currently work for an organization that's called the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And this is we call it a private diplomacy organization. But what that means is we're sort of unofficial mediators, effectively. So we go around the world, we try and keep a low profile, we work on armed conflict, but we're not official in the same way that the United Nations or a person representing a government is official. We're essentially private actors. And about 2.5 years ago, while I was working on something else with Humanitarian Dialogue, I decided to set up this program, which is called the Organised Crime and Peacemaking Program, to try and fill what I saw as one of the biggest gaps and one of the biggest problems in peacemaking and mediation. And that is the fact that the international mediation and peacemaking had not come to terms with how organised crime and illicit economies are shaping conflict, how they're driving violence, and how they're often playing a key role in determining whether a peace process is successful, whether it isn't. And now this is a gap that I had sort of seen for several years working in the peace sector. And as Andrea said, I worked for many years with the United Nations, doing different things, sort of peacekeeping, mediation, security sector reform, working on crime prevention a bit as well. And I'd worked in different conflict zones: South Sudan, Nepal, Timor-Leste, Myanmar. But again and again, the reality of the conflicts that I was working on was that there was something about our approaches to the international community that didn't quite fit. And it was based on, I would say, a lack of appreciation or perhaps a misunderstanding of crime and conflict and how to deal with the problem. And maybe I'll just give you a little sort of quick story to illustrate this. So my first ever peacekeeping mission was in Timor-Leste. And this is a small island, used to be part of Indonesia and became independent in 2002. When I was there in 2007, 5 years after independence, there was a lot of violence. And this violence was rooted in the behavior of these, what they called martial arts gangs. So, you can imagine I'm driving around in my shiny UN truck, having a great time. And then suddenly I'd be in the middle of the city. There'd be an enormous roadblock on fire, or there'd be gangs fighting with machetes. And this violence was intense, and it was ongoing, and it was making the lives of communities in the area very, very, very miserable. But the common wisdom was this is a social problem, that this is a question of youth. This is a question of lack of economic opportunities, all of which is, of course, true. But one day, suddenly the violence all stopped. It was like someone had flicked a switch. And the same youth problems were still in place. The same economic challenges were still in place. And we were thinking, why has this happened? And it turns out the reason why it happened was because there was a political deal amongst the elites in Timor. And so it made me realize that all of this violence was being instrumentalized by political elites to play out their political rivalries. And this was my first taste of how crime, in this case martial arts, gangs, and politics is often intertwined once you start to scratch the surface. And yet this was there, and I saw this in several other conflict zones where I was working. Myanmar is a classic example of I think a peace process that where the reality of the conflict was fundamentally shaped by criminal interests in illicit economies, but the peace process completely ignored it. And so this is really a blind spot, I would say, for the mediation sector and the peacemaking sector. And there are particularly two aspects to this blind spot. One is a failure to come to terms with kind of what I've already described, how crime and illicit economies are shaping traditional or political armed conflict. But the other part is a failure to respond to criminal armed violence. So those sorts of contexts where the violence is viewed as homicides, it's not viewed as a conflict, an armed conflict as such. And the classic examples of that you see across Latin America, particularly in urban spaces. So I set up a program at HD to deal with all of this from the mediation perspective. And I do believe it's the only international mediation program that exists that looks consistently at this issue. So I suppose that tells you a little bit about how I came to this issue. And now I'm going to sort of dig into the topic a little bit more. And I want to dig into this whole question of how crime and politics intersect, because I think that's key to the question of why this is interesting for mediators. And I'm going to start with an anecdote. In 1999, the then CIA director, who was a guy called Jim Woolsey, was appearing before US Congress. And he said, and I quote, if you should chance to strike up a conversation with an articulate English-speaking Russian in one of the luxury hotels along Lake Geneva, and he's wearing a $3,000 suit, and he tells you he's an executive of a Russian trading company, and he wants to talk to you about a joint venture, there are four possibilities. One, he may be what he says he is. Two, he may be a Russian intelligence officer working undercover. Three, he may be part of an organized crime group. But four, and this is the really interesting possibility, he may be all of those things at once, and that none of these three institutions have any problem whatsoever with that arrangement. Now, the reason why I like this anecdote is not only because I live in Geneva, so I see a lot of people like this around, but also because I think it clearly illustrates how in the modern world in which we're operating, political, criminal, and business actors and political, criminal, and business strategies are increasingly indistinguishable. Right, so for most mediators and negotiators working on armed conflict, we're very focused on and comfortable with understanding and dealing with political issues. That's the whole underpinning of sort of the classic approach to mediation. But I would argue that in many of the contexts, probably most of the contexts where we're working, you cannot understand and deal with the political unless you understand and deal with the criminal. And I think it's worth reflecting on how this has not always been the case. I mean, there's always been elements of this, but how it's kind of gone into overdrive in the last 20 years. And the main reasons for this are globalization and advances in technology. So the globalization and these advances in technology have really allowed organized crime to effectively go global and to project power and engage beyond the locations where they're based or where they started. And these organized criminal networks or structured organizations, they often seek out conflict countries and fragile states. And this is because in such places, there are typically quite weak law enforcement, weak criminal justice institutions. You're away from a lot of international law enforcement jurisdiction, the places you can hide in a way. And also importantly, there are often conflict parties who are hungry for money, hungry for ways to fund their wars and their conflicts. And so they're desperately seeking ways to do this. So they represent very useful partners for organized crime. And now this is important because when criminal interests embed themselves in such a context, they're not just politically benign or neutral. Their influence isn't just limited to funding the conflict, a bit like a bank lending money. Criminal interests typically often try and shape the strategic and the political environment in which they find themselves. So in practice, this means that conflict parties get taken over by criminal interests. Suddenly, the criminal interest becomes the objective more than the politics. And as time goes on, this becomes more and more the case. And often a lot of so-called political armed groups are a mix of these different political and criminal agendas. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. This also means that peace transitions become a period when states are vulnerable to criminal capture of state institutions, which, as you might guess, is a bad thing for long-term stability. And the criminal groups themselves can act as spoilers or drive more and more violence, particularly if it's in their business interests. So this all makes the job of a mediator much more complex and much more difficult to deal with. And now I'm going to share a quick slide because I think it's quite useful for illustrating some of this. So hopefully you should be able to see that. Now, what you have here is effectively, this is a chart where you have along one axis the sort of level of political ambition of a particular armed group. And on the other axis, you have the level of criminal activity. And so you can plot any sort of armed group along this axis. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's a way of sort of categorizing armed groups. And in this particular diagram, I've put the so-called political armed groups in blue and the so-called criminal armed groups in red. And what you see is that according to this axis, there are some criminal groups that could be described as more political than some political groups. And vice versa, there's some political groups that could be described as more criminal than some criminal groups. And what is interesting is this sort of moves over time, and there tends to be a sort of a gathering in the middle. So over time, as I've mentioned, political armed groups tend to become more criminal as the point becomes the crime and the economics more than it becomes the ideology and the politics. But you actually see the opposite movement from criminal groups, particularly those that control territory. So over time, they tend to become more political because they need to sort of engage more politically to try and sort of improve their business interests. And so all these groups tend to meet in the middle over time. It's a sort of an interesting phenomenon. But I think the real point of this is just to say that the sort of the simple labelings that the mediation sector tends to do, that certain actors are criminal, certain actors are political. We talk to political actors, we don't talk to criminal. It doesn't make sense when you start to appreciate this blurring and complexity of the reality. And of course, it's not just armed groups. So, you know, a lot of the conflict contexts where my organization works, you see the governments themselves have been very much captured by criminal interests. So in Syria, for example, the Bashar regime became one of the biggest narco states in the last few years. And, you know, you can see in Central Africa, the interests of a lot of governments are intertwined with the interests of the Wagner Group, which is essentially about exploiting materials. Certainly could be described as a criminal entity. And I actually sort of challenge a lot of my colleagues to name me a conflict context where crime is not a significant factor. And often they struggle to do so. Or in my opinion, they struggle to do so. But it's quite funny because I think when people are, it really is a blind spot. It's not like they're deliberately ignoring this. It's just it's not part of the sort of the paradigm to think in these ways for a lot of mediators, and it's kind of an uncomfortable truth for a lot of them. Now, this is a problem because if you know, I think you all obviously, I think, understand mediation quite well. But the sort of the core idea of mediation, as you all know well, is you need to understand the core interests that underpin behaviors. So if you want to change behaviors, if you want to make deals, you've got to really understand what's going on under the surface in terms of the interests of the particular actors you're dealing with. So if we as mediators don't really come to terms with understanding these criminal interests that are under the surface of governments, that are under the surface of armed groups, how are you going to make meaningful and effective deals? And certainly I would argue one of the reasons why peacemaking and mediation of armed conflict has struggled in the last 10, 15 years is precisely because they haven't come to terms with these real economic interests that are driving a lot of the conflict. So if we accept this as reality, the next question is obviously, well, okay, as a mediator, what do you do about it? And I think, to be honest, I think more and more mediators understand and appreciate this reality, but they just don't know what to do about it. And so, you know, I would sort of respond to that by highlighting 3 different strategies that are 3 ways of thinking about this as a mediator. And again, I'm going to share my screen. These 3 basic strategies are, strategy 1 is quite straightforward. You need to really analyze and understand what are the real sort of criminal illicit economic interests. I think that's quite straightforward. I would say that's a no-brainer in all circumstances. Strategy two is what I call crime proofing. Now, this is about preventing or mitigating the negative impact that crime is having or might have on a particular conflict or a peace process. And this can mean a lot of different things in practice, but in its heart, it means understanding the risks that you may make crime worse in your particular context through your activities. So, for example, peace processes like Guatemala in the 1990s or Sierra Leone in the early 2000s were effectively crime blind. They largely ignored illicit economies. And as such, they helped enable criminal capture of the state, which in the long term undermined instability, undermined peace, and caused further problems in those countries. So, I mean, I think there's a lot that needs to be said about crime proofing. I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just give you a little bit of a flavor of what that means in practice as a mediator. Okay, so you need to crime proof it. So how do you do that? Well, as a mediator, a lot of it can come down to who you talk to. Particularly if you are a strong mediator, and by strong mediators, you may be familiar with this term. It's you can have strong mediators who might be like mediators that have leverage and influence, so like the United States government is a strong mediator, or you can be, say, a weak mediator, and without meaning anything pejorative about it, I would describe my organization as a weak mediator. We tend to work as a mediator. We don't have leverage as such, but we have credibility and legitimacy, which allows us to do our work, but we don't have leverage. But if you're a strong mediator, typically who you choose to talk to, particularly in terms of which group you talk to, or which individual within a group, strengthens that individual or group. So you may not have much of a choice often, because you need to talk to the people driving the violence. But if you can go into this situation as a mediator with eyes open, and you can think, okay, in this particular armed group, I know that Fred is very much involved in criminal agendas, but Susan isn't, then I'm going to choose to spend more time talking to Susan, right? So there's this sort of like, there's an ability, if you do have the ability to choose, you can go into that with eyes open and think about who you're talking to and who you're strengthening as a result. And often in a lot of places, there's a myriad of armed groups. You know, armed conflict these days is very fragmented. So you may choose a group that looks more political and less criminal in that sense, right? If you have your analysis done. There's other ways in which you can crime proof. And the obvious one, another obvious one is around the key question of demobilizing combatants. So, you know, if you're following a peace process through towards the end, you want to demobilize armed actors. And, you know, it's a sort of, it doesn't take much to recognize that if these actors have gained status, have gained security, have really built their livelihoods around holding a gun and being a violent actor, justifiable or not. When they demobilize, if they don't have good opportunities, they become very easily recruited by organized criminal interests. It's not that much of a jump to go to being a sort of an armed actor for a political group to being an armed actor for a quote unquote criminal group. Particularly if your armed group beforehand was already engaged in criminal activities anyway to fund the struggle. You already know the people, you already have the networks. So it's about recognizing that risk and designing a process which lowers that risk. And I mean, I can talk more about that, but it's quite a big subject in of its own. But what perhaps I would like to focus more on is the question of active strategies. And what this means is not just a passive sort of addressing of risk, but how do you actively do something as a mediator when you're faced with these sorts of criminally driven violence or criminal interests that are violent? And I'm going to zero in on the sort of the obvious one, I guess, that I get asked about the most, and to be honest, is most of what my operational current work involves, and that's about engaging with criminal armed groups. I'm going to start with definitions, and I don't want to go too deeply into this, but I think it's important to sort of set the scene so we know what we're talking about, because there is a lot of conceptual confusion and sort of conceptual blurring, as I've made clear, between political and criminal. But when I talk about a criminal armed group, and you know, like every person, I love inventing an acronym. So the acronym I'm going to use is a CAG. So when I refer to as a CAG in the rest of the presentation, I'm talking about a criminal armed group. A criminal armed group is essentially an armed group that uses organized violence to pursue agendas that are primarily economic and could be defined as criminal, illegal, or illicit. So I'll let that hang in the air a little bit. But essentially, the reason why I think it's important to make this out is because I'm also talking about some of these groups that are widely perceived as political armed actors, but do engage in criminal activities. There's an element of that as well. They're primarily driven by criminal interests. And I'm also talking about, well, perhaps easy to say, what I'm not talking about is criminalized governments. That's a whole different complex topic about how you deal with sort of state-embedded criminal groups or criminal networks. So I'm focusing more on the armed groups that are criminal and how you engage with them and what that means for your mediation and peace process. Now, immediately when you sort of go into this idea of, okay, you're going to have dialogue with a criminal group, you're going to negotiate with a criminal armed actor, immediately everyone jumps to ethical and practical objections, and you know they're fairly straightforward. I think most people would be able to identify some objections without having to think too hard about it. But typically the ethical objections are, well, you know, you're rewarding these guys, you're undermining the rule of law if you're talking to these criminal actors. There's a moral hazard. You're encouraging others to follow suit. If you talk to these guys, and a bunch of other criminal guys are going to pop up, and because they know they can get access to, you know, services, advantages by being a criminal group. And the practical considerations are, these guys are dangerous. You know, they're violent, they're psychopaths. How can you talk to them? Or another practical consideration, which you hear a lot, is, well, you know, these guys are only interested in money. You can't compensate. They make huge amounts of money. You can't compensate them for the money. How can you make a deal with these guys? But actually, when you dig into it, what you find is a lot of these risks also apply to exactly the sorts of actors that organizations like mine have been engaging, political armed actors as they're viewed, for the last 20 years. You know, they're also dangerous, a lot of them. You also run the risk of moral hazard, encouraging more people to take up arms. They're also dangerous, they're violent. I don't think that many are psychopaths, but then not that many criminal actors are actually psychopaths. It's a bit of a myth. And a lot of them, as I've already said quite thoroughly, are engaged in criminal engagement, so they make a lot of money through crime as well. So the reality is that any engagement with any armed actor, whether they're political, whether they're criminal, whether they're state affiliated, involves a degree of moral complexity, a degree of legal complexity, a degree of political risk, a degree of reputational operational risk. So I'm not saying that the risks of engaging with a criminal armed group are not real. I'm saying they're very real and you need to take them very seriously. But they're not so different from all the well-established risks that we know and deal with day to day for years when dealing with political armed groups. So if you then say, okay, so you can hold dialogue with these groups, why would you? And this is grounded in the reality that these actors often hold significant influence in the areas affected by violence and instability. So if you exclude them from dialogue, this may carry its own ethical cost, its own practical cost, because you're missing opportunities to reduce violence, prevent further harm, and achieve a more sustainable peace. The truth is, when you dig into it, a lot of so-called political armed groups, a lot of so-called criminal armed groups often come out of the same root cause conditions. So it's often about lack of opportunity. It's often about exclusion. It's about seeing that the state is not working in your interests. So that means that a lot of the tools that we do use for political mediation, with some tweaks, can also work for quote unquote criminal mediation. And it's been shown to work. From contexts from varied as El Salvador through to South Africa, through to Colombia, to Jamaica, Ecuador, Spain, they have achieved some outcomes, and I'll talk a bit more about that. So if you accept, okay, so you know you can talk to these guys, maybe you should. How do you do it? And I'll split it into perhaps 3 different steps. I'm just checking on the time. It'll depend, maybe 2 steps if I run out of time. But let's go for three areas I want to highlight. Although obviously there's a lot more complexity and detail under the surface. So the first point I'll highlight is the whole question around analyzing and understanding a criminal armed group. And this is no different to when you're approaching any conflict. You need to do a conflict analysis. Exactly the same when you're approaching a conflict involving a criminal actor. And you know, a lot of the analysis is the same, but I'm going to highlight 2 areas that are key that you need to understand. These 2, the first of these areas, and it seems a bit obvious, but you need to understand their illegal economic behaviors. Right? If you don't understand their illegal economic behaviors, you run the risk of not understanding the key motivations and leverage points with the group. So it's difficult to come up with a real solution that aligns with its actual sources of power if you don't understand in detail what those actual sources of power are. And as an aside, I would say we need to do more of this with so-called traditional armed groups as well, but that's another issue. So first point, you need to sort of understand their illegal economic behaviors in as much detail as you can. Secondly, understanding their motivations beyond economics is equally important. And this is, I mentioned the trap that most people fall into is they tend to think, well, criminal groups are only interested in money. That is true of some armed groups, particularly criminal armed groups, particularly what I would say are these sort of hidden trafficking networks that don't like to be visible, that the loose knit networks hide behind the scenes. But most armed groups, particularly those that control territory, are a mix of different agendas. Any armed group is a mix of different agendas: politics, economics, social, security. And a lot of criminal armed groups, they will have political and social agendas, but they're usually not very good at expressing them, or they're usually hidden, often because the groups themselves like to sort of hide a lot of their agendas. And I'll give you a concrete example of this. So a lot of urban armed gangs, for example, they form around a social or a security agenda as much as a criminal one. There's quite a lot of literature on that if you dig into. These groups tend to form because they don't have opportunities. They're maybe under attack from another gang, so they want to protect themselves, maybe their community. They want to control a bit of territory. And critically, they're interested in status. They're more interested in status than about money, often. There was a story, one of someone I work closely with in the work I do in Colombia. He's another British guy like me, just by chance, but he was in Colombia probably about 10 years ago. And he was going around meeting some of these, what they call sicarios. So these people who, are hired to assassinate. They're part of the organized criminal sort of networks, guns for hire, effectively. And he was sitting there in a meeting room with this guy, and this heavily tattooed guy with, gold teeth, and he's sniffing cocaine. The Sicario, not my friend. And he says to my friends, explaining the whole idea of what they call desistance, of how you can leave a criminal life and go legitimate, go legal. And this guy's interested. He says, yeah, that sounds great. He goes, I tell you what I'd like to do. What's the name? What's that guy? That guy with the suit, has that nice car down the road. What does he do? And my friend Adam says, well, he's a bank manager. The guy's, yeah, I want to do that. Right. So it's not the life that they want. They don't necessarily want these violent lives. They want the status. They do want sometimes the economics to come with it. But they're often a complex mix of these different interests. And to be frank, the lives of a lot of these criminal actors are quite miserable. So you'll talk to guys like the Sicario or urban armed gangs, and their lives are quite poor. They're quite violent. They don't make lots of money. And even if you speak to the leaders of a cartel, for example, they often want to leave that life as well. They just usually want to leave it with most of their money, and they don't want to spend the rest of their life in jail. So for a lot of these actors, it might surprise you how much, if you're a state and you're negotiating, or if you're a mediator working with a state to negotiate, a state has a lot to offer some of these criminal actors. And there are deals to be made there. But what I would say is, there's lots of different types of criminal groups, so it's difficult to generalize too much. And there are some that are more conducive, or in the past have been shown to be more conducive to peacemaking than others. And I'll share another slide here, just to give you a bit of a sense of that. This is a Venn diagram that sort of captures different criteria. And the closer you are as an armed group to the center of this diagram, so the more you have these overlapping characteristics, arguably the more conducive you are to peacemaking. And I'll go through some of them. So if you control territory, you tend to be more conducive to peacemaking. If you have some level of political or ideological agendas or interests, that makes it easier for a negotiation or a mediation, because there's other factors you can work with beyond economics. Crucially, if you have a social constituency, and what I mean by this is if you're an armed group that's formed around a particular social constituency, so it could be an ethnic constituency, could be a particular community that you've come out of, any kind of shared identity. If you're an armed actor that has a low political or military threat to the state, so what you find is sort of successful peacemaking has tended to work with these smaller armed groups, whereas these bigger cartel-style organizations, there's not much evidence of successful peace negotiations with them. Not to say it's not possible, but it's often more complex and difficult. And the last point is it helps if you're not fundamentally integrated into international, transnational criminal networks. And what I mean by that is, often with these international criminal networks, it's often quite sort of franchised out. You're not inherently part of these networks if you're a group. So, organized criminal networks will use different gangs, for example, to sort of do their bidding. So if you're sort of a gang who sometimes taps into these international networks, sometimes you work with them, but they're not fundamentally part of your group, it's easier to sort of isolate yourself from these international networks and then to have a peacemaking process. I think this is probably quite straightforward why, but just because, it's when you're negotiating, mediating, you need all the influential actors on the table. And if these got these sort of hidden forces abroad that you can't access, who are making the decisions, then you're going to have a very, very challenging peace process. And we see this in there's this one of the cities in Colombia where we're active, a place called Buenaventura. There's a massive uptick in violence this year between the two gangs who we engage with a lot. And talking to these gangs, they're like, it's not we can't make the decision to stop the violence, because it was higher up the chain of command who was deciding that there should be this violence. It was sort of organized criminal interests hidden way beyond the surface who were making these decisions. So that can be a challenge when dealing with any kind of criminal armed group. So if those are the kind of actors, perhaps it's worth digging into sort of for the last remaining minutes. Question: well, what kind of deals can you make with these guys? And to be honest, this is the question I get the most, including from the executive director of my organization, who asks this to me like at least sort of once a week. And I understand it is complex, because if you think of our traditional model of peacemaking, it's about taking a political armed group, and instead of having it contest power through violence, you want it to contest power through politics. It can be a power sharing deal, it could be a political party if it's a democratic system. But obviously that pathway is typically not open for a criminal armed group. You don't necessarily want a criminal armed group to become a political party. But to be honest, this is a process and a model that's not really been working anywhere in the world very well for the last 10 years or so. So I mean, this is my point I make to a lot of mediators, is we need creative options anyway. So when we think about what kind of details you can make, I'm going to split it into short term and long term, and I'll sort of highlight some of the main points. Although, as I said, there's a lot of complexity sort of under the surface. So in the short term, the sorts of deals you can expect from these groups is reductions in violence or some other humanitarian outcome, which is a lot like sort of the kind of deals you can expect with other political armed groups. So you can imagine, in return for a group saying, okay, we're going to stop recruiting children, we're going to stop targeting civilians, we're going to stop doing kidnappings, the state may say, okay, well, we're going to give you better prison conditions. We're going to suspend arrests for a while. We're going to give you prisoner releases. We're going to give your families food. These are the most common sort of deals that you see, and typically they're structured around truces between criminal groups, rather than truces between the criminal group and the state. And that's often because a lot of the criminal violence, when you're dealing with sort of more pure criminal groups, is between groups fighting over market territory. And because the state doesn't like to sort of give criminal groups typically the credibility of thinking that they can be on a par with the state and they can have a deal. So those are the most common sort of deals you see. And in the recent years, my team in Colombia has facilitated a number of these truces in Colombia. And specifically, we've been working with these urban gangs. And it does work. You see in a couple of cities like Buenaventura and Medellin, we've got the lowest levels of urban homicides in these two cities for something like 14 years. And these cities were previously among the top 10 most violent in the world. But these sorts of agreements obviously don't deal with the root causes of crime, and they don't serve the problems of long-term violence and crime. So often when the deal ends, when the truce ends, the violence just spikes again. So the really interesting work for a mediator or a negotiator lies around long-term deals. And there are ways of achieving more permanent drops in violence. And I'm going to highlight two approaches, although there are more than this. The first I'll highlight is what I call, and lots of other people call, violence interruption models. You might be familiar with these from cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, mostly coming out of the United States. They're mostly urban. They mostly involve gangs as opposed to other criminal groups. But I think their lessons can be drawn from these for other kinds of criminal groups as well. And essentially, interruption models are structures that you set up in a particular context, and you use former gang members as insider mediators, credible messengers, some people call them. And they go out there, they interrupt violence when there's violence coming. They improve relations between criminal gangs, communities, police, and they help to provide pathways out of gangs for members of gangs. So that's an interesting model, and I think a lot can be done with that model. If you're familiar with the more political forms of mediation, it's not completely dissimilar to having a peace infrastructure. Right, so we've set up a lot of peace infrastructures in parts of Africa, which are sort of a local level, ongoing conflict resolution bodies using insider mediators, so mediators from the context itself, and that's quite successful. But I think violence interruption models have a sort of like they have a bit more to add than just simple peace infrastructure. And the second thing I want to highlight is something I would call sort of complete group transformation. So rather than just sort of pulling away individuals from the group, which tends to be the way that violence interruption models do it, you work with individuals to give them other opportunities. There are ways in which you can transform the whole group sort of all at once into something else. And this starts to look a little bit like what happens with political groups turning into political parties. But this is more about finding ways to take a particular criminal armed actor and to make it a legitimate legal entity, typically a social entity, because they don't really have the capacity to become a political party. If the state is willing to do the painful process of going through sort of some of the political, economic, and social reform that you need to address the underlying drivers of violence, and that means taking a good sort of a long, hard look at its own failings as a state, there are ways in which you can turn criminal groups into legitimate social entities. And this was actually progressed quite far in Ecuador under the President Correa. They basically turned these gangs into legal entities that had employment, had recognition, had a level of status that kept the gangs happy. And the state recognized its own failures. I wasn't involved in this process, but I remember I've heard stories of corrupt police being brought into town squares and publicly shamed. So, there's a sort of acceptance from the state that, yes, it's not like you're the bad guys and we're the good guys. There's complexity here. And so this really worked quite well for several years. But unfortunately, as typically happens, over time, the support of the government waned. And this normally comes down to a question of resources, because you need to continue to invest in this. But it's also often due to public sentiment. There's after time, a lot of the public sentiment says, well, why are these people getting help? Why don't I get help? Right. And that's not an insurmountable problem. But if the political will isn't there, then it gets difficult. So it just goes to show, I think, what is possible. But it does require sustained engagement from the state in a particular, and a willingness from the state to be able to look at the role that it has played in creating the conditions for the formation of these groups. And this is difficult because politicians typically are short term. They'll talk to a criminal group for political expediency. When it suits them, when it doesn't, then they stop. The classic thing is that a lot of politicians will buy votes by talking to criminal groups in order to get their support for an election. And then that's as far as that sort of particular dialogue goes. But I'll finish by saying that when the political will is there is potential for very real and meaningful change. Now, I didn't have time to talk about some of the granular things about how you make contact with some of these groups, but I'm happy to sort of address that if there's any questions around that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben. I could listen to you for another 2 hours, I think, about this topic, and I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure you too. So please just open your mics or put your hands up and then ask all the question you want to Ben. I see Nauman. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin, for this wonderful session. And I would like Andrea to also bring you again for this session, because in this particular 1 hour, I don't think so you have covered each and everything, and a lot of questions are still in my mind to ask you. So one particular question, the overall exercise that you explained, that how one engages with these criminal or political groups, because there are multiple stakeholders involved, from government, political parties, criminal gangs. As a mediator, if one wants to work in this particular area or want to establish, how is that a mediator can be accepted by these parties to bring his services or her services to those people? Because there's a lot of information, misinformation, disinformation. Nobody wants to bring these kind of people and want a resolution of the conflict, because there are a lot of factors. Somebody is for peace, others are not. So how can a mediator can actually engage in such situations? And number 2, if I may ask also regarding the neutrality, since you said that one way is to deal with these people is to bring in some sort of deals. either bring in the people to the fold of the public rehabilitation or everything. So as a mediator, how can a mediator be neutral in the way that he or she knows that these people has done crimes that one can imagine, cannot even imagine, and then the government is actually bringing in those people under or the in the sidelines behind closed doors to actually deal with them and do not want to disclose such information with their public. So these are some of the questions that really raises my concerns as a neutral mediator.
Great. Perhaps I'll jump in. The great question, great questions. I'll jump in on that one, and then I'll look forward to taking more questions, because I think there's a lot in that. So I'll start with the second part first, is a sort of like, how can you be impartial when you deal with these sort of actors, a lot of whom have done very nasty stuff? I think that's really a very important question, and it goes to the heart of some of the challenges of this. And often, me and my team, we talk a lot about the sort of the challenge of public sentiment and the stigma attached to criminal actors. But what I would say is, I'll perhaps start by saying something about the labels, really. I think, sometimes the label of criminal is a lot like the label of terrorist, as in it's sort of used, instrumentalized, right, where in order to stigmatize. And it works, right? So, in the same way that people say, well, you can't talk to terrorists, people say you can't talk to criminals, right? They're sort of criminal, it's pejorative. So, part of the challenge is to sort of get past these labels, because often they are used for a reason. The government will call an actor a criminal in order to stigmatize them, right? Because it's in their interest. And similarly, they'll call actors terrorists in order to stigmatize them. And that's not to ignore the sort of some of the terrible things these actors have done, but it's sort of to recognize that there may be more complexity under the surface. And once you can start to come up with a bit of a language that deals with this better. And this is something they did very successfully. A guy called Father Greg Boyle in Los Angeles did this very successfully. Came up with a different kind of language, right? Which is where a lot of faith-based practitioners are very good at this stuff. And some of the few, a lot of the work that's been done in this space is done by faith-based actors. Because, you can start to think of these things that we're all coming from the same communities often, particularly with things like gangs, right? They are parcel of the community. And if you can start to sort of deal with, well, why are these people behaving like they have? And often it is these issues, these root causes, like, sort of like they've been exclusion, it's, poverty, those sorts of things. You can start to, in a way, create a language that can manage some of that stigma, which can make it an easier place to start to have these discussions. And in fact, to be honest, I mean, again, there's a mirror here with some of these political armed groups, right? A lot of these political armed groups I've engaged and have done equally as terrible things as a lot of the criminal armed groups that I've engaged with. And so the same practices are important, I would say, when you're dealing with criminal armed groups, which is, it's not to ignore what they've done, but to sort of try and focus on the problem rather than the people. And then to have these processes, these transitional justice processes, where you can give victims a voice, that allows you to try and heal and build ultimately at the end of the day. And yes, just like with political processes, the most egregious should go to jail, right? But maybe they will sort of, part of the thing is they will serve less time. In any sort of conflict, there's always this balance between sort of, achieving something and justice, right? There's a balance between peace and justice. It's always a struggle. Always a struggle. But what I would say is it's not so different when you're dealing with a criminal group than when you're dealing with a political group. And that sort of also links in a little bit with your first question of how do you persuade a state or how do you persuade a criminal group to engage? Often the environment isn't particularly conducive, particularly with the state, right? So maybe taking the state first. If you can have someone like a Father Greg Boyle leading the way, sort of making it acceptable, like he did in Los Angeles, that's really helpful. So for me, I'm looking at this as a point of view as an international mediator, a third party, weak mediator. Coming into that, if I have a partner, like someone from the local community, like a Father Greg Boyle or some other sort of representative of the church, that's often my way in, right? So, to be very practical about it, I can start by offering this person my support. Would you like capacity building? Would you like me to sort of connect you with other people who've done this work? And you sort of work through an intermediary. Right, that can be one way of doing it. That can be useful because the legal and political complexities about coming in from the outside, right? If you go straight into direct engagement, it's legally, politically complicated. And then you have to sort of, in a sense, wait for windows of opportunities. So for states, there are often windows of opportunities where they will be willing to consider talking to criminal groups. For example, you often see after they've done a crackdown that's failed, you might have a window of opportunity there to try and persuade them that the time is right for mediation and negotiation. And looking at the other side, the criminal armed group, it's not totally dissimilar to the way that you get access to some of these hard to reach political groups, in that you know, part of it is through your networks. So if you've got a credibility, so my colleague who works for me in Colombia, he is close to the former head of the Latin Kings gang in New York, who's now one of these former gang members who goes around sort of as working on violence interruption and as a sort of peacemaker mediator. And the Latin Kings are all over Latin America. They're well known. So he opened the door for my colleague to work in Ecuador with the Latin Kings in Ecuador. You know, a lot of these, it's not too dissimilar from how my organization got access to work with other armed groups through these insurgency political groups are often networks. So if you can get a sort of, not quite a letter of recommendation, but a sort of a verbal certification that, hey, this guy's okay, that can open the door. In addition to that, or in the absence of that, there are ways of starting to sort of tease some of these criminal actors out of the woodwork. So, for example, in Mali, there's an example of where the UN, they wanted to sort of get access to some of these criminal actors, but, you know, you can't just sort of do a workshop on criminal problems and then invite them. So what they did is they did a workshop on, you know, the economic implications of the peace process for business, you know, and then suddenly all these business people come out of the woodwork, because, as I said, a lot of these things, there's such a blurry line between the legitimate business people and the criminal people. It's just a labeling, right? It's a bit meaningless in places sometimes where you have no functioning rule of law, right? So that's one way. Or if you're talking about sort of more sort of community-based criminal armed groups, you could have a public discussion with the community about managing violence and security. And you'll find these guys will pop up in the background. And if you have your sort of networks and you can do your analysis, you'll figure out, oh, that's okay, a representative from that particular criminal group, and you can, you know, kind of work with that. So there are these sorts of techniques that get you access to it. And then, of course, on top of that, you do need the usual techniques of impartiality, of you know, the soft technique, what I call soft techniques of building a relationship, listening, that will allow you to finally be accepted as a mediator. So, I mean, there's a lot that can be said about that, but it's a good question, but I want to give time to some of the other questions as well. Thanks very much.
Two more questions, my colleague, Andrew Bulu. Do you want to go ahead?
Thank you so much, Andrea. So Ben, thank you for an insightful discussion. It's an ongoing discussion, and my questions are double layered. So I guess the first one is, and I'd just like to prick your brain on this, because in the beginning you kind of mentioned, you know, kind of these two factions, right? Where you get the armed groups, and then you get the political groups. But I guess in our conceptualization of criminality, there's almost like this inextricable link between criminality and politics. And you made this distinction. And I think what I want to actually get into is, how do you make that distinction? Because our concept of criminality is that these factions exist because the government or the political actors permit its existence. Yet you speak of them as, you know, these separate groups. And then I just kind of wonder how firstly, how these groups exist separately. And because there's always, again, that perceived inextricable link between criminality and politics. And obviously then the kind of overlap between politics and economics. As Hazel Henderson said, economics is not a science, it's politics in disguise. And then the second part of my question was around going back to, you know, kind of looking at these different actors. And you mentioned again this distinction between the weak players or the weak negotiators, and obviously the negotiators like the United States, like your Donald Trumps, that have a lot more political influence and a lot more economic influence. And I like also that you made this distinction between the economic interests and the political interests. And if the interests are economical or political, given that we are in this context weak mediators that are not able to facilitate those types of deals or agreements at a political and economical level, what kind of role can we play? Because my concept, my understanding of negotiators and mediators in that context would have to be people that could guarantee the political and economic interests that these factions would have. So if you get these two groups, whether in an African context or an Asian context, that one political power or power within an economical context, we do not have the power as weak mediators and negotiators to kind of set the scene or to guarantee these political and economic interests. So I guess, Ben, I mean, as I said, the question is double-layered, but just, to kind of summarize it again, there's this inextricable link between, kind of politics and criminality. How do you make that distinction? And then obviously the second part of the questions around what role can we play as weak mediators and negotiators that aren't able to guarantee either the political or the economic interests that these factions might have. Thank you, Ben.
No, thanks. Yeah, another great question, and getting right to the heart of some of my struggles. I guess there is a problem of language and labeling, right? I agree with you 100%, by the way, about the links between politics and crime and the sort of continuum and the impossible to distinguish them. 100%. That's actually at the core of what I try and sell. I guess there's a problem here because what I'm doing is I'm sort of working with the mediation sector and the previous prejudices, right? So if you think, as a lot of mediators think, well, that group's political, that group's criminal. So I have to talk about, I could also say, another way of putting it might be I might be talking about those groups widely perceived as political, even if maybe they're not, or those groups widely perceived as criminal, even if maybe they're not, right? There's a sort of, there's so much complexity. So I have been cheating a little bit by using a shorthand, but you're absolutely right. There is that continuum. And I liked a lot what you said about the role of the state. And this is something I didn't go into in particular, and it's a particular sort of complex element of this, but one of my colleagues who, I'm not a criminologist, he says the state is what they call crimogenic, right? So in all of these contexts, these states and the ways they have behaved or the ways they failed to behave have created these groups, right? So, and the people like this head of the Latin Kings who is an amazing guy. Actually, there's an HBO documentary about him, a guy called King Tone Fernandez. When I talk to him, he talks about, if you really want to solve the problem of a criminal group, you need the state and the communities to accept their responsibility for it as well. It's not about just the criminal group sort of saying, I'm sorry, for doing this. The communities need to sort of do that. It's healing and building and apologizing all around sort of thing. So yeah, that is a challenge. And there's other elements of that which are about sort of, I guess, literally the economic ties between quote unquote criminal groups and political structures, which is always a problem. And then that comes down to is when is the political imperative there? And by political, I mean sort of like, the interests, classic political, right? Like the electoral interests, if you will, of a particular set of politicians. When do those align so that they're willing to try something else, right? It may even overpower their specific economic interests at a particular time linked to that group. So you're absolutely right. It's massively complex, and labels and vocabulary are a problem. But your fundamental analysis, I agree with 100%. On the whole weak, strong mediator thing, you're right. So there's a little bit. You can have the most effect as a weak mediator when you're working with the backing of the state, right? Obviously, so that's what we have in Colombia. We're lucky that there we have an umbrella process where the state has said we're going to negotiate with everyone. Sort of everything's on the table, and then we work as a mediator within that. To bring that process together. So that's the ideal, but that doesn't mean you can't do anything if you don't have that. That's something that if you want these long-term transformational agreements, ultimately you're going to have to get that. But that doesn't mean you do nothing until you have that. So often what you see is with a lot of these peacemaking mediations that have happened already with criminal groups, they often start by a particular actor doing it themselves for a while without state backing quietly. They're illegal, the risks to that, political risks. But if you can start to engage and bring about the conditions, and when the windows of opportunity arise, then you can bring the sort of state in. And there's actually an interesting case of this journalist in Bangladesh, this guy who just off his own back decided to try and negotiate for about 10 years with these political groups, piracy groups. And he did, and eventually he succeeded. It's a really interesting case. It's in the Sundarbans in the Bangladesh, if you want to look it up. But he just did it off his own back as a journalist, and he eventually sort of brought the state and these piracy groups together just from sort of his own will, quite frankly, and managed to sort of persuade them to engage, and then there were deals, and the pirates demobilized.
There are 2 more questions left, but as I see that people are already leaving, I just want to say thank you so much for everybody who joined this webinar. And Ole and Cecile, we're going to have your questions. Of course, I take your questions. I just want to take this minute to say goodbye to everyone who has to leave. I hope to see you soon, or we see you soon. Also, a little spoiler, I think that Jabulu and Ian are working on a little format that is exactly about this topic. So Naumann, also to your question, how can I be a mediator in this? How can I get connections? We are working on it. It will come soon.